Nobody is saying it out loud. Not the White House, not the press briefings, not the carefully worded statements coming out of Washington, but the signals are everywhere, if you know how to read them. Donald Trump is flying to Beijing in a matter of days, and the version of this visit that the world is being sold, a confident American president engaging China from a position of strength, is not the full picture, not even close. Because right now, as Air Force One prepares for that flight, an American ally is absorbing Iranian missile strikes. The world's most critical energy waterway is effectively closed. Global oil prices are climbing toward levels that threaten recession. 2,000 ships are stranded on either side of a strait that America cannot fully reopen. And the one nation that holds the key to unlocking all of it is the same nation Trump is flying to meet. This is not a summit from a position of strength. This is a summit from a position of urgent need. My name is Dr. Adrian Cole. This is Empire Signal. And today we are going to show you exactly why Trump's Beijing visit is not what it appears, what forced his hand, what leverage he is walking in without, and why Xi Jinping may be the most prepared leader sitting at any negotiating table in the world right now. Stay with me. Let us start with the fire. On May 4th, Iran launched a barrage of missiles and drones at the United Arab Emirates. 12 ballistic missiles, 3 cruise missiles, 4 drones. Most were intercepted by the UAE's sophisticated American-supplied defense systems, but one got through, and it did not hit a random target. It hit Fujairah. Now, if you do not know what Fujairah is, that is exactly the problem. Because Fujairah is not just a port city on the eastern coast of the UAE, it is the terminus of a pipeline that the UAE spent billions of dollars building specifically to move its oil without going through the Strait of Hormuz. Think about that for a moment. The UAE looked at its map, saw that Iran controlled the choke point through which all of its oil exports flowed, and made a decision. We will build an alternative, a bypass, a way to move our energy to the world without ever entering Iranian-controlled waters. They built it. They invested in it. They called it their insurance policy against Iranian leverage. And on May 4th, Iran hit it anyway. This was not an accident. This was not collateral damage. Iran sent a message with surgical precision. There is no bypass. There is no workaround. There is no infrastructure you can build, no pipeline you can lay, no port you can develop that puts you beyond our reach. For the UAE, it was a moment of profound strategic shock. For Trump, it was a crisis that landed on top of a crisis, because the Strait of Hormuz had already been effectively closed since February 28th, the day the US-Israel war on Iran began, and the consequences of that closure had been building for months, quietly at first, then louder, then impossible to ignore. 20% of the world's oil flows through that strait in normal times, every single day. Hundreds of tankers, millions of barrels, keeping the lights on in Europe, keeping factories running in Asia, keeping fuel prices manageable for ordinary Americans who were already feeling the pressure of elevated costs. When that waterway closed, the world did not immediately collapse, but it began to tighten. Oil prices climbed, shipping costs exploded, companies that depended on Gulf energy began making contingency plans. Governments that had never thought seriously about energy security suddenly found it at the top of every cabinet meeting agenda, and approximately 2,000 ships found themselves stranded, sitting on either side of a waterway that America's military had helped destabilize and could not fully reopen. This is the context in which Trump announced Project Freedom. Project Freedom, his initiative to escort commercial ships through the Strait of Hormuz using American naval forces, a direct challenge to Iran's blockade, a declaration that the United States would not allow a regional power to hold the global energy system hostage. The announcement was bold, confident, exactly the kind of decisive leadership moment that Trump's political brand is built on. But here is what the announcement did not solve. Shipping companies looked at Project Freedom and hesitated, because Iran had already demonstrated it would fire on ships attempting to use the strait without IRGC permission, because insurance companies had already pulled coverage for vessels attempting the passage, because no shipping executive in the world wanted to be the one whose tanker became the next headline when Iranian missiles found their mark. American naval power can escort ships through the strait. It cannot guarantee that Iran will not fire. It cannot make insurance companies comfortable. It cannot force commercial operators to accept risks that their entire business model is built to avoid. And so the ships remained stranded. The strait remained effectively closed. The pressure kept building. And then Iran hit Fujairah. In one strike, Tehran destroyed the narrative that there was an alternative to Hormuz, reminded every oil-dependent nation on the planet that the energy chokehold was absolute, and sent a message to Trump specifically. Project Freedom is not freedom. It is escalation. And escalation has consequences. This is the world Trump is carrying with him to Beijing. Now let us talk about what Xi Jinping sees when he looks at this situation. Because Xi does not see chaos. Xi does not see crisis. Xi sees something that Chinese strategists have a word for. Xi. It roughly translates as strategic momentum, the alignment of circumstances that creates natural advantage for those patient enough to wait for it. China has been building Xi in this conflict since the moment it began. When the US-Israel war on Iran started in February, Beijing made a careful, calculated decision. It would not join the conflict. It would not condemn Iran publicly. It would not cut its economic ties with Tehran. It would simply continue doing business, buying oil, maintaining what it called normal bilateral relations with a nation that was now at war with America. Every barrel of discounted Iranian oil that China purchased kept Tehran financially viable, kept the IRGC funded, kept the Strait of Hormuz closed, kept global energy prices elevated. And elevated global energy prices meant something very specific for China's economic competitors. Higher fuel costs hurt American consumers. Higher fuel costs hurt European manufacturers. Higher fuel costs slow the economies of nations that depend on Gulf energy, which is most of the developed world. China, meanwhile, was buying that same Gulf energy at sanctioned prices, discounted, below market rate, while its competitors paid premium prices on global markets. This is not an accident. This is strategy. Patient, long-term, quietly devastating strategy. And it gets more precise than that. The US has publicly stated that China is effectively funding Iran through its continued economic relationship with Tehran. American officials have urged Beijing to use its influence to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz, to pressure Iran toward de-escalation, to use the leverage that China's economic partnership gives it over Iranian decision-making. Beijing's response has been consistent, measured, diplomatically appropriate, and completely non-committal, because why would China give up its most valuable piece of leverage before the summit? This is the question that Trump's advisors are wrestling with right now, and it is the question that will define what actually happens in Beijing on May 14th. Trump walks into that meeting needing several things. He needs trade concessions, numbers he can announce. He needs movement on Iran, some signal that China will use its influence to help resolve the Hormuz crisis. He needs something on North Korea. He needs, in short, a deal that looks like American strength on the global stage. Xi walks into that meeting holding the key to the one thing Trump needs most urgently, the Strait of Hormuz, not directly, not through military power, but through the economic relationship with Iran that keeps Tehran viable and gives Beijing genuine influence over Iranian decision-making. If Xi calls Tehran and says, "The time has come to de-escalate, to reopen the strait, to find a path toward resolution," Iran listens. Not because Iran does whatever China says, but because China is Iran's economic lifeline, and economic lifelines create real leverage. Trump knows this, his advisors know this, and Xi knows that they know. This is the hidden architecture of the Beijing summit. This is why Trump is flying east with far less leverage than the public presentation suggests. Now, here is where it gets genuinely dangerous. Because when a leader walks into a negotiation more desperate than his counterpart, concessions happen. Concessions that are not announced at press conferences. Concessions buried in diplomatic language. Concessions that only become visible months later when their implications fully materialize. What might those concessions look like? On trade, Trump may accept terms that look like Chinese purchases of American goods, but are structured in ways that give Beijing flexibility to underdeliver without formal consequences. A headline number that obscures a weaker underlying commitment. On technology, Washington has been applying maximum pressure on Chinese tech companies, restricting access to advanced semiconductors, blocking Chinese firms from critical American markets. Some of that pressure may quietly ease, not through a formal announcement, through regulatory decisions, enforcement priorities, the thousand small choices that shape policy without making headlines. And then there is Taiwan. Taiwan is always present in any US-China negotiation. Always. Even when it is not on the official agenda, even when neither side mentions it publicly, it exists in the room like a pressure system, invisible but felt by everyone. Xi will push on Taiwan. He will push on American arms sales to Taipei. He will push on the language Washington uses to describe its commitment to Taiwan's security. He will push on the principle of strategic ambiguity that has kept the peace in the Taiwan Strait for decades. And Trump, focused on getting his Hormuz solution, his trade headline, his summit success, may give ground in ways that are subtle enough not to trigger immediate alarm, but significant enough to be felt in Tokyo, Seoul, Manila, and Canberra. Every American ally in the Pacific is watching Beijing, not for what gets announced, for what shifts in the margins, for the signal beneath the signal, because they understand something that Western media has been slow to articulate clearly. The Beijing summit is not just a bilateral meeting between two leaders. It is a referendum on the credibility of American power in a world under maximum stress. And credibility, once it begins to erode, does not recover easily. But there is one more dimension to this story that deserves careful attention, one that connects everything we have discussed, the fire in Fujairah, the closed strait, the Beijing summit, into a single coherent picture of how global power actually operates beneath the surface. It is about time. Not the news cycle, not the 48-hour headlines, not the week-to-week political calendar that dominates how most people understand international events. The kind of time that great powers think in. Decades, generations. The long arc of strategic positioning that makes short-term sacrifices worthwhile because the long-term payoff is so significant. China thinks in this kind of time. It always has. When Deng Xiaoping began China's modernization in the late 1970s, he gave his country a strategic instruction that guided its foreign policy for 40 years. Hide your strength, bide your time. Do not challenge American dominance directly. Build quietly. Accumulate capability. Wait for the moment when the balance shifts naturally in your favor. Xi Jinping believes that moment has arrived. Not because China has surpassed America militarily. It has not. Not because the Chinese economy has overtaken the American one in every meaningful measure. It has not done that either. But because the conditions that sustained American dominance, the unchallenged control of global sea lanes, the unquestioned reliability of American security guarantees, the dollar's absolute centrality to global commerce, the willingness of American allies to accept Washington's leadership without question, all of those conditions are now under simultaneous pressure for the first time since the end of the Cold War. And Xi is walking into a meeting with the American president at precisely the moment that pressure is most acute. The Hormuz crisis did not create this situation. It accelerated it. It compressed what might have been years of gradual strategic shift into months of acute crisis management. And in doing so, it handed Beijing a negotiating position of unusual strength at an unusually important moment. This is why the Beijing summit matters far beyond any trade deal that gets announced, far beyond any numbers that get cited at the press conference, far beyond the handshake photos and the diplomatic language. What happens in that room will either confirm or challenge Xi's assessment that the moment of strategic shift has arrived. That American power, while still formidable, is now negotiable in ways it was not a decade ago. That concessions can be extracted on Taiwan, on technology, on the broader terms of the bilateral relationship that would have been unthinkable when American dominance was more secure. If Trump walks out of Beijing having delivered what Xi wanted, that confirmation will ripple through every calculation being made in Moscow, in Tehran, in Pyongyang, in every capital that is watching to understand where American power's limits actually lie. And if Trump walks out having held firm, having resisted the pressure, having protected American commitments without giving ground on the issues that matter most, then a different signal goes out. One that restores some of the credibility that these months of crisis have eroded. The outcome is genuinely uncertain, and that uncertainty itself is remarkable, because American presidents do not usually fly to Beijing in situations where the outcome is genuinely uncertain. They go when they can control the terms, when they hold the leverage, when the meeting is designed to deliver American priorities. This meeting is different. And that difference, that shift in the underlying balance of the negotiation, is the most important story of the decade that almost nobody is telling clearly enough. This is the weight that Trump carries onto that plane. The fire in Fujairah, the closed strait, the stranded ships, the climbing oil prices, the desperate need for a solution that only Beijing can help deliver. The allies watching from the margins, the adversaries calculating what any concession means for their own situations. This is not the summit of a confident superpower operating from strength. This is the summit of a nation managing multiple simultaneous crises and needing one of its greatest rivals to help resolve the most urgent of them. History is full of moments like this. Moments where the gap between the public presentation of power and the private reality of leverage becomes the hinge on which outcomes turn. Moments where what is said in the room matters less than what is given up to get into the room in the first place. We are in one of those moments now. Watch Trump's body language in Beijing. Watch the language of the joint statement. Every word will have been negotiated in advance with extraordinary care. Watch what American officials say in the days after the summit about Hormuz, about Taiwan, about the trade relationship, and watch China's behavior in the weeks that follow. Because that behavior, more than any press conference, more than any joint communique, more than any carefully worded diplomatic readout, will tell you what Beijing actually got from this meeting. The summit is days away. The fire is still burning in Fujairah, the strait is still closed, and Xi Jinping is waiting. There is one final thing I want to leave you with. One question that cuts through all the diplomatic language, all the geopolitical analysis, all the strategic positioning. What does America's response to this moment tell the world about what kind of power it is in 2026? Because nations are not just judged by their military strength or their economic size. They are judged by how they behave under pressure, by whether their commitments hold when holding them is costly, by whether their allies can rely on them when reliability is most needed, by whether their adversaries find them predictable enough to negotiate with seriously. Trump's Beijing visit is a test of all of these things simultaneously. Conducted in public, watched by every government on the planet, interpreted by every strategist, every intelligence service, every foreign ministry trying to understand what the next 5 years of global order will look like. The outcome matters, deeply, in ways that will take years to fully understand. But the signals will start moving the moment Air Force One lands in Beijing. Watch carefully. My name is Dr. Adrian Cole. This is Empire Signal. The next signal drops in 48 hours. Stay with us.